I accepted the job at Glacier National Park because I needed to disappear, not in the way people usually mean that. I hadn't committed a crime or betrayed anyone, at least not in any way that would hold up in court. What I'd done was simpler and more damning. I'd looked at someone the wrong way when my guard was down, a supervisor at my previous position, a moment where my face must have shown everything I thought about her competence, her shortcuts, her willingness to file false incident reports. She'd seen it, and she'd made my remaining 6 months unbearable enough that I'd resigned without another job lined up. The gap in my employment didn't concern the hiring manager at Glacier. A 53-year-old with wilderness certifications and 15 years of experience didn't need much excuse. They needed bodies for the season. The backcountry required rangers willing to work alone for weeks at a time, patrolling remote sections, checking campsites, maintaining trails that saw maybe 50 hikers annually. The pay was modest. The isolation was the point. I'd spent my second week studying maps of my assigned territory. The ridgeline sector stretched across the park's northwestern quadrant, roughly 12,000 acres of mixed forest, alpine meadow, and rock face. My primary station was Mineral Camp, a historic ranger station built in 1924 on the eastern shore of Mineral Lake, at an elevation of 6,400 feet. The nearest other ranger station was 23 miles away by trail. The nearest town was 40 miles out. The cabin was smaller than I expected, though the photograph during orientation had been honest about its dimensions. A single large room served as kitchen, office, and bedroom. A cast-iron wood stove occupied one corner. A cot and footlocker constituted the bedroom section. A writing desk faced a window overlooking the lake. The outhouse stood 30 yards distant, a relic that smelled of decades despite recent maintenance. Water came from a hand pump connected to a cistern fed by spring runoff. I'd arrived in late May after the snowmelt had stabilized but before the summer crowds pushed into the park. The sky held that particular quality of northern light in late spring, bright enough to work by until nearly 9 in the evening, harsh in its clarity. I unpacked my gear methodically. 2 radios, both charged and tested. A satellite phone for emergencies. Topographic maps with my patrol routes marked in red pen. Field notebooks. The standard first aid kit expanded with additional supplies. Bear spray in 3 accessible locations. I'd been a ranger long enough to understand what wildlife authorities never said in official capacities. The animals in Glacier had become habituated to human presence without becoming comfortable with it. They'd learned that human camps often contained food, which meant approaching human camps was occasionally productive. But they'd also learned that some humans were unpredictable in their reactions. The calculus kept them mostly distant, interested but wary. What I hadn't fully absorbed from the orientation materials was how absolute the silence could be. That first evening, I sat on the small porch of the cabin watching the light drain from the sky. The lake was perfectly still, a dark mirror reflecting the mountains on its far shore. A great blue heron stood motionless in the shallows near the inlet stream, so patient it seemed part of the landscape. No wind moved the pines. The temperature had dropped to the low 40s, that perfect threshold where cold came in through breath and flesh rather than making its presence obvious. I was completely alone. The realization didn't arrive as fear but as clarification. At my previous position in the ranger station near Mount Rainier, I'd always been within radio contact of other rangers. Visitors came through regularly during business hours. Even on night shifts, the station buildings had housed 6 of us within the compound, our presences available to each other as reassurance. Here there was no reassurance available. If something happened, I would address it alone or not at all. I'd taken the job for precisely this reason. The next morning, I began my patrol routine. The first days were always about establishing rhythm. I left the cabin at 6 in the morning, before the heat built, and followed the western trail that skirted Mineral Lake before climbing toward Ridgeline Pass. The trail was in good condition, which surprised me. The spring season typically left winter damage that required weeks of clearing. Someone had put significant work into the Ridgeline route. I was making notes about recent trail maintenance when I found the first piece of equipment. It was a hiking boot, partially visible in a tangle of exposed roots at the trail's edge, perhaps a mile and a half from the cabin. Good condition, newer model, size 8 or 9. I pulled it free carefully, remembering training protocol for potential incident scenes. Inside, the insole was intact and only slightly dampened. The boot had been there less than a week, I estimated. Perhaps only a few days. I waited for concern to rise in me, but what I felt instead was curiosity. I looked around the immediate area, checking the ground for signs of distress, for scuff marks or blood or scattered belongings. The grass around the spot showed normal compression, no evidence of a struggle. The boot sat at the trail edge as though it had been placed there deliberately rather than lost. I marked the location on my map and photographed the boot from multiple angles before placing it in a sealed evidence bag. Old habit from the first park where I'd worked, before becoming a simple patrol ranger. I continued up the trail, watching for additional items, finding nothing. The incident required a report. I radioed it in at the ranger station that evening, describing the boot and location, describing the condition and placement. The dispatcher took the information with the tone of someone recording a data point that would be filed and probably forgotten. A lost boot wasn't an emergency. Hikers lost gear constantly. No reports of missing persons in your sector, the dispatcher confirmed. But keep an eye out, we'll log it. They'd log it. And then if no one reported a missing hiker, it would become part of the background noise of wilderness management. Lost and found items, abandoned gear, the detritus of human presence in places humans were never meant to stay. That first night, wind came down from the ridgeline, pushing through the cabin's ill-fitting windows with sounds like breath. I lay on the cot, listening to the wooden structure settle and creak around me. The darkness outside was complete in a way that 30 years of living in or near cities had not prepared me for. No ambient light reflected from cloud cover. No distant highway hum or distant city glow. Just the black weight of night, pressing against the cabin's thin walls. I thought about the boot. I thought about someone hiking this area, losing their footing, tumbling from the trail into the dark woods where search and rescue would struggle for days. I thought about how long a person could lie injured in the forest before the cold or infection or animal scavengers ended the question. By morning, the wind had passed, and the ridgeline was clear against a sky the color of old silver. I made coffee on the stove and sat at my desk reviewing my supply inventory. The cabin had been stocked with basic provisions by the prior ranger, whoever had worked here last season. Flour, salt, canned vegetables, dried meat. Enough to survive a 2-month stretch if resupply helicopters couldn't reach due to weather. I was writing notes when I heard something move near the cabin's north wall. It wasn't the sound of wind or settling earth. It was the specific sound of weight shifting on fallen branches. The particular crunch of something large moving through the dry pine needles that accumulated on the forest floor. The sound stopped. I rose from my desk and moved to the window, pressing my face close to the glass, trying to see into the shadows beneath the nearest stands of subalpine fir. Nothing visible. But the feeling of presence remained. The sense of attention focused on the cabin. I waited for 10 minutes. The sound didn't repeat. I moved to the cabin's door and opened it slowly, holding the frame to prevent squeaking, and stepped into the morning air. The forest around the cabin appeared empty. Birds sang their morning routines from the high branches, A squirrel chattered somewhere in the distance. The mountains rose behind the tree line, indifferent and eternal. By logic, it had been a deer or elk. Large animals moved through this sector regularly, following established migration routes and feeding patterns. They were curious about human structures without being hostile. They moved through camps at dawn and dusk, rarely seen but evidence of their passage visible in tracks and scat and the occasional glimpse of antlered silhouettes moving through timber. By logic, I'd been alone since arriving. I grabbed my pack and headed toward the trail, deciding that patrol work would serve me better than paperwork this morning. I took the eastern circuit, moving away from the lake and up into the higher elevations where afternoon storms could develop with little warning. The physical work of maintaining the trail, clearing deadfall, brushing overhanging branches from the path, gave my hands purpose and my mind something to follow other than the residual unease from the morning's sound. By the time I returned to the cabin that afternoon, I'd convinced myself that settling into routine would resolve the low-level anxiety I was experiencing. New environments always generated this response. It would fade as the place became familiar. The wilderness would stop being alien and become simply known. That night, I secured the cabin with more care than the design really allowed. I checked the window latches, though they provided no real security. I locked the cabin door, which involved a skeleton key and a mechanism probably unchanged since the 1950s. I positioned my radio and satellite phone within arm's reach of the cot. I kept the bear spray on the footlocker beside me. The forest sounds that night were different from the night before. Something larger was moving somewhere in the darkness beyond the cabin. I heard it move from the east toward the north, heard it pause, heard it continue. Not an urgent sound, not desperate, methodical. The sound of something on a deliberate path, searching or following or simply passing through. I lay still on the cot and listened to the sound fade toward the ridgeline. The boot was gone by the morning of my 4th day at Mineral Camp. I'd marked it in my evidence bag and set it in the small storage shed adjacent to the cabin, intending to transport it to the ranger station on my next supply run. When I checked the shed that morning, looking for bearing grease for the hand pump, I found the shelf where I'd placed the bag empty. The bag itself sat on the ground 5 feet away, open, the boot absent. An animal had done this. Raccoons or foxes, or perhaps a curious bear, had managed the latch on the storage shed's door and excavated the boot from its bag. I should have been relieved by the obvious explanation. Instead, I felt the first cold finger of something else beginning to move through my perception of the situation. The boot had been placed on the trail deliberately, I realized. Not dropped or lost, but positioned, placed where it would be found. I called the ranger station and asked if anyone had reported missing persons in the past few days. The same dispatcher checked the log and confirmed nothing official. But she added something unexpected. Couple hikers came through the checkpoint yesterday. Said they'd seen some gear scattered on one of the northern trails yesterday morning. Didn't stay to investigate, though. Said it felt off. Off how? I asked. Didn't elaborate. Just said the whole area had a weird vibe. We didn't get a proper report, but it's noted on the daily log. I marked the time and location on my map and decided to investigate the northern area more thoroughly on my next circuit. For the remainder of the day, I focused on maintenance work, forcing my attention toward physical tasks that required precision and didn't allow for speculation. That evening, a storm moved in from the west. The weather forecast I'd reviewed that morning had mentioned a 30% chance of afternoon showers. The system that arrived around sunset was substantially more aggressive than the prediction. Rain hammered the cabin's roof with the sound of thrown gravel. Wind came in gusts that seemed to shake the entire structure. The temperature dropped precipitously, falling into the low 30s as darkness accumulated. I had the wood stove burning hot, keeping the interior cabin temperature tolerable. Water dripped from a leak in the eastern corner, requiring a bucket to prevent damage to the floor. The cabin creaked and groaned with each gust, the sound of stressed wood and straining nails working against lateral pressure. Around 9 in the evening, I heard something beyond the rain and wind. It was a sound like calling. Not words, but something with intention behind it. A sound that moved from the forest toward the cabin and then away, moved again, retreated. It didn't sound quite like an animal vocalization, but neither was it obviously human. The pitch seemed wrong for either category. It was a sound that existed in the space between recognizable options. I stood from my cot and moved to the window, pressing against the glass. The rain obscured everything beyond 10 feet from the cabin. The forest was a wall of darkness punctuated by the violence of wind-tossed branches. I saw nothing. The calling sound didn't repeat. By 10 o'clock, exhaustion had overtaken my alertness. I allowed myself to sleep, the satellite phone within reach, my hand resting on the bear spray. If something required a response tonight, it would have to be something immediate and obvious. Vague sounds and undefined unease would have to wait until daylight. I woke to silence. The rain had stopped. The wind had passed. The cabin held that heavy quiet of the early morning, when night was surrendering to the first legitimate light. I checked my watch. 4:47 a.m. Still more than an hour before I'd intended to wake, but sleep had released me completely. I lay on the cot, listening. The silence was so complete it seemed almost solid. No wind through the eaves. No creature sounds from the forest. No movement of water, just the held breath quality of deep wild places before the day begins. Then I heard footsteps. They moved slowly around the cabin's perimeter, coming from the north side, passing the window where I lay, continuing toward the rear. Not the quick tread of an animal, not the uncertain step of a lost hiker. These were measured, deliberate footsteps, the gait of someone walking with purpose and familiarity. I rose from the cot silently, keeping low, moving toward the rifle locker I'd noted during orientation. The cabin kept 2 rifles secured in a locked cabinet, standard equipment for ranger stations in bear country. My hands were shaking as I worked the combination. 6289, the year the station was established, according to the placard above the cabinet. The lock disengaged. I pulled the cabinet open and selected the 308, checking the chamber, finding it loaded. The footsteps had reached the rear of the cabin, where the outhouse stood. I heard them pause there. Then, impossibly, they began to move again toward the north side, moving faster now, crossing the ground that should have required, based on the cabin's dimensions and the direction of the sounds, at least 30 seconds to traverse. They'd crossed it in perhaps half that time. The footsteps stopped at the cabin's north wall. I pressed myself against the cabin's western corner, the rifle raised, my shoulder positioned to bring the weapon to my eye in a single motion. I waited for the footsteps to approach the door, to test the lock, to make some kind of overt demand or attempt at entry. Instead, there was a sound like hands moving across the cabin's exterior logs. Not grabbing or pulling, touching, almost like someone was tracing the wood grain, feeling the surface, running their fingers along the length of the wall. The sensation was worse than any threat would have been. Worse because it suggested a kind of intimacy with the space, a familiarity that shouldn't exist. I moved to the door, rifle in hand, and yanked it open. The pre-dawn air was cold and clear. The ground around the cabin was undisturbed. No footprints marked the pine needle carpet. The soil was still soft from the previous day's rain. Should have shown clear depressions from anyone walking around the structure. There was nothing. I stood in the doorway, weapon raised, scanning the forest. My breath came in shallow pulls. The fear that had been accumulating across the 4 days at Mineral Camp had finally crystallized into something operational, something I could aim a rifle at. Nothing emerged from the timber. Nothing challenged me. The forest remained empty of visible threats. I searched the perimeter of the cabin carefully, looking for anything that might explain the sounds. No ladder marks or scratches on the logs. No muddy footprints despite the recent rain. The ground beneath the north wall was pressed and compacted. Something had been there, something substantial, but showed no recognizable track patterns. Just pressure, as though something very large had stood against the cabin for several minutes. By the time I completed the circuit, full dawn was arriving, and my fear had begun to transform into the other direction, toward the possibility that I was experiencing some kind of stress-induced psychological episode. Sleep deprivation could cause auditory hallucinations. The isolation could be affecting my perception. The wind could have created sounds that my mind, primed for threat, had assembled into footsteps and hand-touching. I set the rifle back in its locker and made coffee, trying to return to baseline normality through ritual. I ate plain toast and canned fruit. I reviewed my patrol notes from the previous days. I forced my mind toward practical tasks. By 9 in the morning, I'd made a decision. I would investigate the northern area where the hikers had reported seeing scattered gear. If I found evidence of a real incident, I could file a proper report. If I found nothing, I could mark the investigation complete and dismiss the accumulated strangeness as coincidence and stress. Either way, I would move forward. The Northern Trail system was more difficult terrain than the Western or Eastern circuits. The elevation gain was steeper. The path was narrower in places, cut into cliff faces where a fall would be substantial. The forest was denser, composed of older trees that created perpetual twilight beneath their canopy. I made the hike in the afternoon, moving deliberately, checking for any sign of abandoned gear. I found evidence of a camp perhaps 4 miles north of the cabin. A small clearing set back 50 yards from the trail, visible only if you were specifically looking for it. A fire ring of stones, the char marks suggesting a fire within the past several days. Scattered around the ring, evidence of human presence, a torn sock, a length of cord, a flattened aluminum can. But no tent, no large gear, no indication of emergency. The camp looked abandoned rather than evacuated. Like someone had simply left mid-stay, gathering only what they could carry, leaving the rest behind. I radioed it in to the ranger station and waited for guidance. The dispatcher said they'd send someone to investigate within the week, but no urgency seemed warranted. Abandoned camps were common in the backcountry. Hikers changed their plans, decided the weather was too rough, opted to move on. That night, I didn't try to sleep. I kept the wood stove burning, kept all the lights on that the cabin's limited electrical system could support, kept both radio channels active. I sat at the desk and read through my predecessor's notes, journals left in the filing cabinet that detailed the previous season's activities. The handwriting was hurried and grew progressively less neat as the season advanced. The entries were factual: weather observations, animal sightings, maintenance work completed. But in the margins and between the lines, I found something else: a rising obsession with movement around the cabin during darkness. Multiple entries noted unidentified sounds, a pattern of equipment being moved or missing and reappearing, descriptions of footsteps that moved with impossible speed, notes about the feeling of being watched that became increasingly disturbed and desperate as the season progressed. The final entry was dated October 15th of the previous year. The ranger's name was Marcus Webb. The handwriting here was barely legible. "I can't stay. The things that move here at night, they know where I am. They know the rhythm of my movements. They test the cabin. I think they're learning. I think they're planning. I'm burning my appointment book and leaving at first light. Whatever you do, don't be here at night alone. Don't let them learn you." The entry ended there. No follow-up, no closure. I sat at the desk, Marcus Webb's final words in front of me, and felt something shift in my understanding of my situation. The possibility of psychological crisis receded. Someone else had experienced this. Someone else had heard the footsteps and felt the watching and responded with the same spiraling fear I'd been fighting. I needed to know what had happened to Marcus Webb. The ranger station that served the park's northern sectors was located at Trail Creek, a 40-mile drive from the nearest town. The head ranger there, a woman named Marie Colbert, received me in her office with the kind of careful attention that suggested she recognized the signs of someone in distress. I didn't explain the full situation. I simply asked about Marcus Webb's departure and where he was currently stationed. She was quiet for a long moment, a calculating expression crossing her face. "Marcus requested a transfer after last season, said the Ridgeline sector was too isolated. Too much pressure living alone so far from backup. We reassigned him to work day patrols out of the main station. He's since taken early retirement. Last I heard, he was living in Missoula." "Did he say anything about the cabin? About anything that happened there?" She studied me carefully. "You're the new ranger at Mineral Camp." "Yes." Marcus said the sector was fine, just too quiet. Some people can't handle the solitude. She paused, but he also asked that we increase the supply helicopter frequency. Said the ranger there would probably benefit from more contact with the outside world. "Is there anything in the official reports?" I pressed. "Anything about incidents or unusual activities?" She stood and moved to a filing cabinet, withdrawing a folder. Inside were seasonal activity reports, equipment logs, incident notes. She showed me the official record. No incidents, no accidents, no reports of wildlife problems or safety concerns. Marcus Webb's notes about movement and sounds and things that tested the cabin in darkness were completely absent from the formal record. "Why would he mention it to you privately but not include it in the official reports?" I asked. "Because," Marie said slowly, "official reports create obligations. If he documented something genuine, we would have been required to investigate, possibly to close the sector. If he documented something that might sound like a psychological episode, it would have been noted in his personnel file, potentially affecting his career. So he warned me informally and requested reassignment officially. Clean, practical, and protective of everyone involved." I understood what she was suggesting, that Marcus Webb had chosen to reframe his experience as a simple matter of personal fit rather than risk appearing unreliable or unstable. But her careful tone suggested she believed something had happened. Something real enough to warrant the precaution of warning whoever came after. I returned to Mineral Camp the next afternoon with supplies and a clearer sense of what I was facing. Not a dangerous animal, not a psychological break. Something else entirely. Something that Marcus Webb had experienced and chosen to evacuate rather than confront. That night, I made a decision that felt both brave and foolish. I would stay outside the cabin and watch. I set up a position on the rocky outcropping south of the cabin, with clear sight lines to all sides of the structure. I had a sleeping bag and a thermos of coffee. I had the rifle loaded and positioned within reach. I had a flashlight with fresh batteries, and I had the intention to see whatever came during the hours of darkness. The evening was clear. The stars emerged and accumulated as darkness deepened, the Milky Way becoming visible as a river of light overhead. The temperature dropped steadily, falling into the 20s as the night progressed. I remained alert and still, watching the cabin and the forest beyond. Nothing arrived during the first hours. The forest was genuinely quiet. the kind of quiet that comes from absence of threat rather than suspension of life. Small animals moved through the underbrush. Owls called across the ridgeline. The wind shifted direction twice, coming from different quarters but remaining gentle. Around 2 in the morning, everything changed. The animals went silent. Not gradually, but absolutely and completely. The owls stopped calling mid-sequence. The small rustling movements through the brush ceased. The forest entered a kind of suspended animation, every living thing holding still simultaneously. Then I heard them. They came from the north, moving through the forest in a loose grouping. Not the sound of individual animals, but of multiple somethings. Their movement coordinated and purposeful. I raised the rifle, bringing the scope to my eye, trying to identify shape and form in the darkness. The moonlight was sufficient to see perhaps 30 yards into the timber before the shadows became absolute. They moved past the cabin's north side without pausing, not stopping to test the structure or touch the walls, simply moving with intention, as though heading toward a destination beyond the cabin. I tried to count them as they passed within sight range. 3, 4, possibly 5. The forms seemed to move wrong, their gait unfamiliar in ways I couldn't quite crystallize into a specific problem. Not quite bipedal, but not quite quadrupedal either. Something in between. The rifle was heavy in my hands. Part of my consciousness understood that I should fire, that these were intruders moving through my space, and something about them was wrong enough to warrant force. But another part, the part that was still thinking clearly, recognized that firing on unknown shapes in darkness was how people created actual problems. I watched instead. I bore witness. The grouping of things moved south and east, crossing the meadow that separated the cabin from the steeper forest rise beyond. As they reached the tree line, one of them paused and turned, and for just a moment the angle of its head aligned with the moonlight in a way that allowed me to see its face. It wasn't a face, or it was a face arranged wrong. The features distributed across the skull in patterns that didn't match any animal I could identify. The eyes were too large, set too far apart. The mouth was too wide and seemed to extend further back than a jaw should allow. But it wasn't grotesque in the fantasy sense. It was anatomically present and material. It was a thing that had evolved in its own direction, following principles of survival and adaptation that had nothing to do with the patterns I understood. Then it turned away, and the group disappeared into the deeper forest. I remained in position until dawn, not moving, not lowering the rifle. By the time the light arrived, my body had moved past normal cold into a kind of shock state numbness. I couldn't feel my hands. My lips were stiff, but my mind was sharp in the way that fear sharpens it, every moment clear and crystalline and locked into memory. I packed my gear at first light and went to the cabin, where I used the radio to request an immediate supply helicopter evacuation. I told the dispatcher I'd had a medical emergency, fabricating symptoms that would justify urgent extraction. The helicopter arrived by early afternoon, and I was off the mountain by 2 o'clock. It took me a week of sitting in a motel room in Kalispell before I could function well enough to think about returning. The truth was that I couldn't leave the situation unresolved. Whatever I'd seen, it hadn't threatened me directly. It had moved past the cabin with indifference, and if I abandoned the position, I would spend the rest of my life wondering what I'd really seen, whether I'd imagined the entire thing, whether fear had reassembled random phenomena into something that supported my already existing anxiety. I needed another explanation, or I needed confirmation. The second month at Mineral Camp was different because I understood the structure of what was happening. The things that moved through the forest at night were following a pattern. They arrived between 2 and 3 a.m., moving from north to south in what seemed to be a regular route. They didn't attack or threaten. They didn't attempt to communicate. They simply existed in the space I occupied, crossing the sector with the kind of regularity that suggested migration or regular travel rather than hunting. I documented everything with obsessive precision: the time of arrival, the number of individuals, the exact path they took, the variation in their behavior. Some nights there were 2. Some nights there were 6 or 7. Some nights they didn't appear at all. The appearance didn't vary with weather or season or lunar cycle. It seemed random, which was worse than if it had followed a comprehensible pattern. I learned their movements well enough that I could anticipate their arrival. My body would know, perhaps 5 minutes before I heard them, that the night's crossing was about to begin. My heartbeat would accelerate, the small hairs on my forearms would stand, and then they would emerge from the forest, moving with that wrong-angled gait, crossing the meadow with indifference to my presence. They began to acknowledge me. It started small, a slight change of direction as they passed the cabin, as though they'd noted my position and adjusted their course by a few degrees. Then they began to slow as they approached the cabin, moving past at walking speed, rather than the loping run they maintained in the open meadow. Then they began to pause at the cabin's edge, standing motionless for several seconds before continuing. By the 3rd week, one of them approached the cabin's window where I stood watching. I could see it more clearly at that proximity. The shape was vaguely canine, but wrong in too many ways to count. The fur seemed to move separately from the skin beneath it, as though animated by something independent of the body itself. The eyes were darker than any animal's should be, so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was the face's expression that terrified me most. There was something like recognition in the way it regarded me, something like thought. We stared at each other across the window glass for nearly a minute. I was holding the rifle, but the weapon felt obsolete and strange. Whatever this thing was, bullets seemed like a category mistake, like trying to shoot a sound or an idea. Then it turned and loped away to rejoin the group. The confrontation seemed to communicate something. The next night, the group approached the cabin directly instead of moving past at a distance. They circled it slowly, 3 circuits of the small structure, moving in a formation that was almost ceremonial. I stood inside, rifle ready, knowing with certainty that a trigger pull would accomplish nothing except to announce that I understood the situation as a threat. When they moved away, they traveled in a new direction, not south toward their usual route, but east toward Ridgeline Pass. The realization arrived with sudden clarity. They were leading. They were demonstrating a path. They were trying to communicate something about the geography of the sector, about a direction that mattered. I didn't follow that night, but the next evening, when they appeared and performed the same circling pattern and then moved east, I prepared myself to track them. I armed myself with the rifle and bear spray and my satellite phone. I told myself repeatedly that if the thing seemed to be moving toward violence, I would fire immediately and deal with consequences. I set out after them, staying 50 yards back, trying to maintain sight lines to their movement. They moved east for a mile, then turned north, ascending toward the ridgeline passes. The altitude was climbing, the forest giving way to alpine meadow, the stars overhead becoming brighter as light pollution fell away completely. I was breathing hard, my legs burning from the steep climb, but I maintained the distance. We crested a ridgeline, and they slowed, approaching a series of granite outcroppings that formed a natural shelter. This was where they stopped. This was where they turned and looked back at me, waiting. I approached carefully, rifle raised but not leveled, trying to communicate non-hostility while maintaining the option of defensive action. The one that had looked at me through the window moved forward. I tensed, finger moving to the trigger. It made a sound, Not quite a growl, not quite a howl. Something in between that seemed to come from deeper than its chest, and as the sound was made, it moved toward the rock shelter, gesturing. Actually gesturing, with movement that was almost unmistakably deliberate for me to follow. Inside the shelter, I found him. The hiker had been there for perhaps 2 weeks, judging by the decay. A man in his 60s, wearing expensive hiking gear that marked him as someone accustomed to backcountry travel. He'd apparently come to the shelter for the same reason people often do: escaping weather, seeking shelter, trying to wait out a storm or an injury. The things had found him here. They'd fed on his lower body, legs and groin area methodically consumed, while keeping him alive. He died eventually, the trauma of his wounds finally overwhelming whatever functions remained. But it wasn't a quick process. The evidence suggested days of suffering, days of slow predation. I understood then what they were. Not supernatural, not unnatural. Predators that had adapted to hunting humans specifically, that had learned patterns of human movement and behavior, that understood how to kill in ways that maximized suffering and survival of the wounded prey for extended periods. The things had brought me here to show me what they did, to communicate the consequences of my presence in their territory. I left Glacier National Park the next morning. I called the ranger station and explained that I was ending my assignment immediately due to family emergency. I provided no detail and accepted no argument. By noon, I was driving down the park's west entrance road, watching the mountains recede in my mirrors, feeling like a person escaping something that had been systematically consuming him from the inside. The hiker's body remained in the shelter. I had considered reporting it, calling for a search and rescue helicopter, but the impossibility of explanation stopped me. How would I describe what I'd seen? How would I explain my involvement without facing investigations about my mental stability? And if I reported it truthfully, what would it accomplish except to condemn other rangers to the same isolation and confrontation I'd endured? I called the ranger station once more from a motel in Whitefish and reported finding abandoned human remains in an unnamed shelter on the northeast sector. I provided the coordinates. I said I'd come across them while investigating scattered equipment reported by hikers. I said the remains appeared to be several weeks old and would require official identification and recovery. Within 2 months, the authorities had identified the body as Robert Kendrick, a retired teacher from Denver who'd been reported missing 6 weeks prior. An official incident report concluded that Kendrick had slipped on a steep trail section, broken his leg, managed to reach the shelter, and died of exposure and infection while attempting to wait for rescue that never came. The damage to the body was attributed to wildlife scavenging after death. The explanation was neat and comprehensive, and completely acceptable to everyone who read it. I've never returned to Glacier National Park. I haven't accepted another ranger position in any wilderness sector. I've taken work as an administrative assistant at a suburban park district, attending meetings and reviewing permit applications, and never being more than 5 minutes from other people. Sometimes, late at night, I think about Marcus Webb, who chose the same path of silence and evacuation that I did. I wonder if he sees them still in his dreams, remembers the moment one of them looked at him through a window with something that approximated thought. I think about the pattern they followed, moving north to south across the ridgeline sector with that metronomic regularity. I think about the theory that gradually formulated as I lay alone in that cabin, that they've been hunting humans in Glacier for years, perhaps decades or longer. That park rangers come and go, maintaining the fiction that the wilderness is empty of organized threat, that sometimes hikers disappear and are explained away by weather and bad luck, that predators here have learned not to be seen by anyone who might raise alarms, learned instead to move when darkness is absolute, learned to tolerate human presence, because human rangers are predictable and limited in their ability to affect anything occurring outside human timescale and human understanding. The boot I found on the trail has never left my mind, placed deliberately where I would find it, least as a greeting from a predator species that understands the psychology of humans well enough to communicate through objects we recognize. Sometimes I receive emails from the Department of Interior inviting me to apply for ranger positions in other parks. They're always urgent in their tone, emphasizing shortage of staff and need for experienced personnel. I delete them without responding. There are places human beings were never meant to understand. Places where going deep into the wilderness doesn't lead you away from civilization, but into something older and far more organized. Places where what moves at night has learned not to attack obviously, but to lead, to demonstrate, to show you exactly what it means to be prey in an ecosystem that evolved its predators for your specific anatomy and your specific weaknesses. I think about Mineral Lake sometimes, about how it looked in the pre-dawn light with the stars reflecting on its surface, about the cabin that the government maintains, awaiting the next ranger desperate enough or naive enough to accept the position, and I wonder who they'll send next. Whether the things will be patient with a newcomer, or whether they'll move faster, demand acknowledgement sooner, establish dominance in ways that don't leave room for evacuation. Whether the story, told in this way, might somehow reach another person considering the job and give them the only warning any ranger at Mineral Camp has ever actually received. The wilderness isn't empty. It's full of things that understand you far better than you could ever understand them, and they're keeping track of who stays. My name doesn't matter much anymore. I've stopped answering to it at parties or family dinners. People keep their distance after what happened at Rocky Mountain. Not the incident itself, which never made headlines. Only the restructured division knew the full scope. But something about the way the investigation closed. A man doesn't leave the National Park Service at 34 without scars visible from across the room. Glacier National Park called me in March. I was finishing the paperwork for early severance, sitting in an apartment that smelled of closing down. Cardboard boxes, stale coffee, the particular silence of someone whose phone hasn't rung in weeks. When the regional director called, I almost didn't answer. But something in the formal opening told me this wasn't bereavement or courtesy. This was necessity. We have a ranger station at Keenan Lake, the director said. His name was Peterson, and I'd never met him. Remote sector. The last ranger requested transfer 3 months ago. We've had difficulty staffing it since. Full cabin, equipment, supplies, minimal oversight. The rangers we've sent last season cited isolation as the problem, but their reports were thin on detail. Keenan Lake sits at the north edge of Glacier's backcountry, accessible only by hiking trail or by water taxi from Many Glacier. It's one of those places that appears on park maps as a small blue dot, unremarkable until you stand in front of it. The cabin was built in 1978 during a different era of resource management, when rangers monitored fire danger and wildlife behavior from remote stations. Modern Glacier doesn't really use them that way anymore. Most of the infrastructure sits empty or gets seasonal staffing. The work is straightforward, Peterson continued. Trail maintenance, visitor logs, basic wildlife observation. You'd be alone for 8-day rotations. Resupply every 2 weeks via water taxi. I knew what he wasn't saying. The National Park Service doesn't offer refuge positions to people like me. They don't call burned-out investigators who've been quietly frozen out of advancement. They don't offer clean slates unless something else is dirty. What's the actual problem at Keenan? I asked. Peterson was quiet long enough that I heard him breathing through his nose. There's a pattern in the incident reports. Gaps in radio check-ins. equipment malfunctions that don't make technical sense. One ranger reported sounds outside the cabin at night. Another mentioned finding animal remains that didn't match any native species in our database. When we asked for specifics, he requested immediate transfer. "And you want me to go there and find out what's happening?" "I want you to go there and manage it," Peterson said. Whatever it is, I think he knew I would say yes before I did. The severance was good money, but it was also an ending. This was a door that hadn't quite closed, creaking on its hinges, asking if I was done yet, if I was really finished. I left Denver on a Thursday. The drive to East Glacier took 13 hours. I stayed that night at a motel on the highway, ate a chicken sandwich from the diner next door, and watched the neon sign outside the window blink against absolute darkness. At midnight, I called the Park Service liaison and confirmed arrival for the morning water taxi. The hiking trail to Keenan Lake is 9 miles. I did it in 5 hours, my pack heavy with personal gear and resupply items. The trail cuts through subalpine forest and then into open meadow. Waterfalls feed the lake from 3 directions, their roar constant enough that you stop noticing it after a while. By the time I reached the cabin, my legs burned and my lungs felt scraped raw. The cabin was smaller than I expected. Gray weathered wood, a pitched roof designed to shed heavy snow, a stone chimney attached to the north wall. Solar panels mounted on the roof pointed south toward the weak glacier sun. Behind the cabin, firewood was stacked in careful rows. A small dock extended into the lake, and a rowboat was secured with professional knots. The door was locked. The keys were in my pack, zipped into a small envelope, along with a hand-drawn map showing water sources, equipment locations, and wildlife observation areas marked in red pencil. Someone had taken care with the drawing. The handwriting was precise and careful, which made the notation at the bottom of the map more unsettling. "Do not go to the west shore after dark. Unknown activity." Inside, the cabin was clean. Kitchen on one end, sleeping area on the other. A wood stove dominating the center. Shelves held reference books about flora and fauna. A radio set with a solar battery charger. First aid supplies, and a logbook with entries dating back to September. I made coffee and read the logbook. The entries were written by 3 different rangers in the last 5 months. The first, Derek Huang, made observations about marmot populations and water clarity through October. His entries were dry and professional. In November, a second ranger, Scott, took over. His handwriting was larger, less controlled. His entries grew shorter as weeks passed. By late November, he wrote simply, "Cold. Radio down for 3 hours. No explanation. Fixed it. Heard something outside. Large. Probably moose. Will check perimeter tomorrow." He did check the next morning. The entry read, "No tracks." The third ranger, whose name I never found, the earlier entries gave only initials MR, had taken the station in early January. His entries started with the same professional tone but deteriorated rapidly. On his final day before transfer request, he wrote, "Found remains of small deer near West Shore. Species identification impossible. Bone structure unusual. Something has taken residency in the Western Valley, something that doesn't follow normal predator patterns. I'm done. Request immediate removal. Do not send replacement until problem is assessed by animal control." I closed the logbook and stepped outside. The light was failing. The sun moves differently at that latitude in March, dropping fast once it decides to drop. The lake was a sheet of dark silver, reflecting nothing. I could see the west shore in silhouette, forested and steep, the trees like teeth against the sky. That first night, I locked the cabin door, lit the fire, and sat in the kitchen with the logbook open, reading the same entries over and over. The fire popped and cracked. The wind moved the trees outside, and their shadows moved across the windows. I told myself that rangers are often anxious men, that isolation amplifies normal sounds into threats, that the forest has a way of making you afraid if you let it. But I thought about MR, about the precision of his final entries, and I understood that he wasn't afraid. He was documenting something he'd seen clearly enough to make a decision. He wasn't running from fear, he was running from knowledge. I kept the fire burning all night and didn't sleep. The work was real. Trails needed clearing of winter debris. Sections of damaged boardwalk required assessment. Visitor logs had to be organized. I spent my first week falling into routine, and routine was a comfort. During the day, with sunlight steady and my hands occupied, I could almost believe the logbook entries were the exaggerations of burned-out men. But night changed the place. Each evening, around 11, sounds would come from the forest. Not the sounds I expected, not the obvious calls of elk or the crash of moose through brush. These sounds were subtle and deliberate. Footsteps on the trail, but irregular, sometimes fast, sometimes stopping for long periods. Once I heard what sounded like a person calling from the east shore. Not words, but a wordless vocalization, almost musical. It lasted perhaps 3 minutes, then stopped completely. One night, I heard tapping on the cabin's western window. I was in bed. The sound came in a slow, deliberate pattern. Tap, tap, tap. Silence for 10 seconds. Tap, tap, tap. I took a flashlight and opened the cabin door, expecting to see branches blown against the glass. The window had a clear view of the forest. Nothing moved. The trees stood still in windless night. The tapping didn't resume. I began recording sounds. The cabin had a solar battery that could charge a small digital recorder, and I documented the nightly vocalizations. Some nights there was nothing. Other nights, hours of ambient sound. Movement through brush. What sounded like heavy breathing. Once a sound like fingernails scraping bark. I documented the dates, times, and durations in a new logbook entry, separate from the official records. On my 8th day, I was due for supply-resupply. The water taxi arrived on schedule with fresh food, fuel for the generator, and correspondence from the park office. There was a letter from Peterson. Check in by radio twice daily, 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., it read. Note anything unusual. We're interested in predator activity patterns and any signs of human trespass. Do not investigate incidents alone. Maintain personal safety protocols. Station equipment is for observation only. The language was careful, non-committal, but the underlying message was clear. They knew something was at the lake. They wanted it documented and contained. They didn't want it solved. I began watching the forest with the kind of focus that makes time feel strange. I sat on the dock in the afternoon, binoculars around my neck, scanning the tree line. The forest at Keenan is dense. Douglas fir, Engelmann spruce, whitebark pine. The understory is thick with beergrass and juniper. A large animal could move through there without being seen, traveling parallel to the shore. On day 12, I saw tracks. They were along the shore where the sand was packed wet, about 30 yards from the cabin's eastern corner. The prints were large, perhaps 12 inches long, with 5 toes visible in the clearer ones. The prints were arranged in a nearly straight line, as if something had walked with unusual precision. They led out of the water to the tree line, then disappeared. I measured them carefully with a ruler from the cabin, photographed them with the radio camera, started researching in the reference books on the shelf. No animal native to Glacier leaves prints arranged that way. Not bear, not wolverine, not even moose. The toe configuration suggested something between a primate and a felid, which was impossible. That night, I waited. I sat in darkness in the cabin with a lamp switched off, watching through the window. I had the rifle they'd supplied. For bears, the documentation said, though the rifle seemed too heavy, too functional for that stated purpose. I held it and watched the shoreline. At 2 in the morning, something emerged from the water. I couldn't see it clearly. The starlight was weak and the distance was significant. But I saw the shape, large, moving upright, taking water off its body with what looked like deliberate, practiced movements. It was the size of a man, perhaps slightly larger. It walked toward the east boundary of my visible area, then stopped, and it turned. I could see its head rotating, and I knew with absolute certainty that it was looking at the cabin. Looking at me. I couldn't see features. I couldn't describe them. But I felt the quality of that attention, the weight of being recognized, and something in my chest constricted. I lowered myself below the window level and stayed there for an hour, rifle across my knees, breathing shallow. When I looked again, it was gone. The tracks the next morning showed that it had walked the shore for perhaps a quarter mile, then returned to the water. There was no clear evidence of what the thing was, only the certainty that I'd been studied. I made the 6 p.m. radio check-in and reported unusual wildlife activity. Peterson's response was immediate. He'd been waiting for the signal. "Describe the animal," he said. "Unknown species. Large. Possibly bipedal. Appears to move at night. I'm documenting all sightings. Have you seen it clearly?" The question felt like a trap. "Partial visual. Conditions are dark." "Good," Peterson said. "Keep it that way. Maintain distance. Document from the cabin. Do not attempt close approach or confrontation." "What am I dealing with here?" I asked. Peterson was silent for a long time. In the background I could hear office sounds, computer keys, someone walking. "You're dealing with something that shouldn't exist," he said finally. "That's what your predecessors discovered. That's why they left. I need you to manage that fact rather than solve it. Can you do that?" I closed my eyes. "How long?" 6 months, minimum. If you can last that, we'll rotate you out. If you can't, request transfer like the others. No one would blame you." He cut the connection. I updated my personal logbook that night, day 12. Visual confirmation of unknown entity. Bipedal, intelligent movement patterns, capable of sustained observation, appears to take interest in human activity. Will maintain defensive protocols. Sleep in shifts. Nothing to report officially. The nights after that were different. The forest stopped pretending to be an empty space. The sounds became more aggressive, more purposeful. Something was moving around the cabin's perimeter constantly. I would hear scraping at the north wall, near the chimney. I would hear what sounded like testing of the window frames. Once I heard something that could only be described as a voice. Human-like in structure but with inflections that no human throat should produce, calling from the west shore. It was calling out my name, not my real name. The name I'd stopped answering to. But the way it pronounced it, stretched across syllables I'd never heard emphasized that way, told me it had learned it somehow. From radio communications, perhaps, from Peterson's official paperwork. It was doing more than observing. It was learning, and it was beginning to test me. By day 20, I understood that I was being hunted. Not in the predatory sense where a hunter actively pursues prey. I was being stalked in a pattern more similar to study, observation, testing of defenses, gathering of information. The creature knew the cabin's schedule now. It knew when I moved from room to room. It knew that I didn't leave after dark. The sounds at night became more specific. I heard scratching at the base of the door. I heard something that sounded like breathing, pressed against the outside walls. The quality of these sounds was too deliberate, too focused. Whatever was out there wasn't a wild animal operating on instinct. It was thinking. It was planning. One afternoon, I was splitting firewood at the rear of the cabin when I found something on the woodpile. It was a partial remains, what looked like a marmot, but the body was arranged with care. The head was placed on top of a length of carefully stripped willow bark. The remaining bones were arranged in a specific pattern, almost geometric. It wasn't the work of a predator. It was a message. I photographed it, documented the location, and buried the remains. But I understood what it meant. I'm aware of your space. I'm capable of actions you can understand. I can place intention here. That night, I heard something different. It started as a sound like wind, but it was too structured, too rhythmic. I realized after several minutes that it was breathing. Deep, steady breathing, and it was coming from outside the cabin's eastern wall, pressed against the window I was sitting near. I picked up the rifle and moved to the center of the room. The breathing continued for nearly 3 minutes. I could almost sync my own respiration to it. Then I heard what sounded like a hand, or something shaped like a hand, sliding down the glass. Slowly, deliberately. The sound continued all the way to the bottom of the window frame. "What do you want?" I heard myself say out loud. The window went silent. The breathing stopped. In that silence, I had a moment of absolute clarity. This thing outside the cabin wasn't just an animal. It was curious about me in the way that intelligence is curious. It wanted to know what I was, what I would do, what my limits were. And the methodical way it was learning suggested it had engaged in this process before. It knew how to study a human being. The thought that followed that realization was worse. If it knows how to study humans, there must have been other humans to study. The official Park Service records went back 5 years for the Keenan Lake Station. The logbook only covered recent rotations, but the cabin had been in operation since 1978. That meant hundreds of ranger rotations, hundreds of nights in this cabin. How many of those rangers had heard sounds at night? How many had seen tracks? How many had sat in darkness like I was sitting, listening to something learn their shape? I made my evening radio check-in. Peterson answered, waiting as always. "I need a complete historical log of personnel rotations at this station," I said. "Anyone who's worked here in the last 10 years. That's not available through normal channels," Peterson said carefully. "Then it exists, but you're not going to give it to me. If I gave it to you, I'd have to explain the pattern. If I explain the pattern, I'd have to acknowledge that the Park Service has been deliberately rotating rangers through a station we know is unsafe. That would create legal complications. So you already know what's here. We know it exists. We don't know what it is. And as long as we don't officially know, it's not officially our problem. But it is a problem, which is why we needed someone like you, someone who's already outside the system, someone who can document it." "And then what?" Peterson didn't answer immediately. I could hear him breathing, could imagine him sitting in some climate-controlled office in a building full of institutional gray. "Then we decide whether it's a resource that needs management or an aberration that needs containment." I understood he meant the creature. I wasn't entirely sure I was wrong to wonder if he also meant me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the cabin with every light on, door barred, keeping eyes on all visible points. The creature did come to the windows. I could hear it moving along the outer wall, pausing at each window, testing the frames, but it didn't attempt entry. It seemed content to exist in proximity, to establish that it could reach me if it chose to. The territorial message was clear. This is our space now. You're only here because I allow it. Around 4 in the morning, I heard something new. A voice. A voice that sounded exactly like mine. It was my inflection, my vocabulary, but coming from outside the cabin. It was repeating things I'd said on radio check-ins, fragments of reports I'd made to Peterson, phrases I'd used when describing the creature, my own voice, speaking my own words, thrown back at me from the darkness. I turned off all the lights and sat in absolute darkness, because seeing the cabin's familiar interior while hearing that voice was more disturbing than facing whatever was making the sound in the black. The thing was capable of mimicry that wasn't just vocal. It was copying language. It was learning to speak like me. When dawn came, it was the palest and most beautiful sunrise I'd seen at the lake. The sky turned rose and gold above the mountains. The water reflected colors that seemed to come from some interior source. It was gorgeous in a way that felt specifically cruel, because it meant the beautiful morning and the thing out there existed in the same world, in the same moment. I broke the rule that evening. I radioed Peterson and told him I wanted the record, the true record, the personnel history, the incident reports that had been filed and then somehow disappeared or been dismissed. The actual documentation of what was happening at Keenan Lake. I can't do that, Peterson said. Then I'm done. You need to authorize my transfer, or I'm walking out. There's no walkout from Keenan Lake. You're in the backcountry. You're committed until the next water taxi. Then get the water taxi here, not my call. I shut off the radio. I spent the next 2 days in a state of controlled rage and fear. I maintained the perimeter checks. I made observations. I recorded sounds. But I was also moving toward something, toward a decision that hadn't quite crystallized. On day 24, I found something that changed everything. I was doing maintenance on the north slope of the cabin's roof when I noticed something in the rock face beyond. A cave mouth, barely visible through the trees, perhaps 200 yards away. But visible in the cave was something that looked like worked stone, flat faces that weren't natural weathering. I photographed it and made notes. But I also understood something about the architecture of the thing that was hunting me. It had shelter. It had a place it went. And if I could find that place, I could understand what I was dealing with. The logical part of my mind, the part that had been trained in investigation, knew this was dangerous thinking. The part that was running on desperation and the raw knowledge of being studied like I was a specimen knew something else. I needed information more than I needed safety. I made a decision that would define the rest of my time at Keenan Lake. I left at first light, before the creature could establish its nightly patterns. The hike to the cave took longer than I expected, because the terrain was rough and I had to move carefully. Reading the ground for tracks, I found them easily enough once I was close. Deep prints in the soft earth, arranged in that same nearly straight line that suggested intelligence and deliberate movement. The cave mouth was larger than it appeared from a distance. The stone face around it was ancient granite, weathered smooth by millennia of wind and water. But inside the cave, I could see the evidence of recent passage. Dirt scattered outward, something large moving in and out repeatedly. I had the rifle and a flashlight. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. The cave descended slowly, the passage wide enough for me to walk upright. The walls were cool and damp. The smell was odd, a mix of animal musk and something older, something that reminded me of earth after heavy rain turned soil, the smell of deep things. 30 yards in, the passage widened into a chamber. The flashlight beam caught something that made me stop breathing. It was a collection. The chamber wall was lined with objects, clothing, tools, bones arranged in patterns, and on a rough platform of stone in the center of the chamber was something that looked almost like an altar, covered in carefully arranged items. I moved closer, keeping the rifle ready, though I knew if anything was here, the rifle wouldn't help. The items on the altar were personal. A ranger badge from Glacier National Park, dated 1987. A watch stopped at 2:47, a photograph of a man I didn't recognize, his face young and smiling. And underneath everything, a leather journal, its pages yellowed and fragile. My hands were shaking when I opened it. The handwriting was looped and careful, from an era when people were taught to write precisely. The first entry was dated June 14, 1987. Arrived at station today. Beautiful lake. Rangers said this place is bad luck, but every ranger thinks their place is bad luck. Tomorrow, I'll begin proper observations. I flipped through pages, entries describing the work, the routine, the solitude. Then, around the middle of the journal, the entries changed. I'm not alone. I know this now. Something moves in the forest. Not a bear or moose. Something else. Something that watches. The entries became more frequent, more agitated. The handwriting deteriorated. I found the final entry, in pencil, barely legible. It's learning me. I can hear it at night, copying the sounds I make. My voice, my laugh. It's taking pieces of me. And I think that's what it wants. To wear us. To learn how to be us. I'm going to the cave tomorrow. I'm going to find where it lives. I'm going to understand, even if understanding is the last thing I do. The entry was dated June 29, 1987. I was holding a dead man's final thoughts, a ranger who had disappeared from official records nearly 4 decades ago. The Park Service knew, they had known, and they had kept rotating rangers through the station anyway, documenting the problem, containing the knowledge. Waiting. Waiting for what? I heard the sound behind me, a sharp exhalation, almost a laugh. I spun with the rifle raised, flashlight cutting through the darkness. It was standing at the chamber entrance. I couldn't see it clearly even with the light on it. The flashlight beam seemed to slide past the creature without quite catching it, the way light behaves in certain optics when there's some fundamental wrongness with perspective. But I could see enough to understand scale. It was 7 feet tall at least, shoulders broad enough to fill the passage, and it was looking at me with an awareness so sharp and focused that I understood I was facing intelligence that wasn't just human level. It was something older. "You're not supposed to be here," I heard myself say, and then it answered. Not in words, but in the copying of my voice, shaped around a question. "You're not supposed to be here." It was mocking me, learning the rhythm of my speech. And I understood in that moment what the creature was doing, what it had always been doing. It was collecting humans. It was learning to wear our shapes. The ranger's badge, the watch, the photograph, these were trophies of individuals it had studied successfully, and I was the latest specimen in what was apparently a multi-decade research program conducted by something that lived in the deep places beneath Glacier National Park. I raised the rifle. It did nothing. It simply watched as I aimed at its center mass. "You can't shoot what doesn't fully exist in your understanding," it said, using my voice with perfect inflection. I fired. The sound in the cave was enormous, deafening. The bullet hit something solid. I heard the impact, but the creature simply stepped aside. Not panicked, not frightened, with the same methodical awareness it had shown every other night. I fired again, and again. The muzzle flashes illuminated the cave in strobing snapshots. The creature moved with inhuman fluidity, never quite where my aim predicted. And when I emptied the magazine, it was still standing, still watching, still making that soft exhalation that might have been a laugh. "Fear makes you inaccurate," it said with my voice. I dropped the rifle and ran. The passage back to daylight was a terror-blurred sprint. My boots skidded on loose stone. My flashlight fell, and I continued in darkness, following the scent of fresh air, following the memory of the way in. I could hear it behind me, not chasing, but following with patient certainty. It was hurting me, letting me run, knowing I had nowhere to go. I burst from the cave mouth into sunlight that felt like violence. I ran downslope toward the cabin, toward the known space, toward the radio that could call the world. When I reached the cabin, I sealed the door, activated the emergency beacon, and for the first time made a report that wasn't carefully couched language. I told Peterson what was here, what it was capable of, what the Park Service had known. His response was silence for a full minute. Then, "You can't report this. There's a dead ranger in that cave. Multiple dead rangers. The cave doesn't exist," Peterson said. "The creatures don't exist, and if you file this report, your credibility will be destroyed. Every investigation you've conducted, every case you've worked, it will all be reopened and undermined. You'll spend the next 5 years in legal proceedings. Or you can understand that what happens at Keenan Lake stays at Keenan Lake." I understood then. The Park Service wasn't trying to document the creature for scientific purposes. They were containing knowledge. They were preserving the existence of a place where things happened that couldn't be allowed to exist in the official record. A place where people disappeared and were studied and were replaced by something wearing the shape of understanding. The water taxi came the next morning. I don't remember the hike out. I remember emerging from the forest near Many Glacier and seeing the taxi waiting. I remember the driver asking if everything was okay, and me saying yes without knowing what I was saying. I submitted a formal request for transfer. Peterson approved it within hours. I was rotated out with full severance, a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, and a job offer. A desk position in administration, where I could work quietly and keep what I knew contained in the appropriate places. I accepted. It's been 8 months since I left Keenan Lake. I work in an office in Denver now. I process paperwork for park assignments. I schedule rotations. I manage the system that keeps rangers moving through problematic stations, keeping them unaware of the true nature of the cycles they're part of. And I understand what Peterson really wanted. He didn't need someone to investigate the creature at Keenan Lake. He needed someone to become part of the containment apparatus. He needed someone who knew the truth, who had faced the thing and lived, to take a position of authority within the system. Someone who could guide the right people into rotation, who could ensure the creature remained fed, studied, and contained within acceptable parameters. Every month, I scan the ranger rotation requests. I look for the ones for men who are broken in specific ways, men running from personal failure, men with nothing to lose, men who won't be missed, and I send them to Keenan Lake. I tell myself that the creature is trapped there, that it's contained, that what it takes is a small price for keeping it from walking into the world. But I'm not sure anymore if that's true, or if I'm just the latest person being warned by something that learned to think like me. Sometimes, in deep night, I hear scratching at my apartment window. I live on the 14th floor. There's nothing to hold the scratching, but the sound is always the same. Slow, deliberate, testing the frame. And sometimes I hear my own voice, from somewhere in the darkness outside, asking in my exact inflection, "How does it feel, knowing what you've become?" I never answer, but I think it already knows. The creature at Keenan Lake isn't something that can be killed or removed. It's not something that can be truly studied, because the act of studying it changes what you are. The Park Service understands this. They've accepted it, and now I accept it too. Peterson called me last week. Not about official business, just a brief message on the work phone. The next ranger for Keenan is scheduled for arrival Thursday. Can you verify the transfer is complete? I checked the rotation. A man named Marcus, former military, living alone, no close family connections. Exactly the kind of person who disappears from the world without questions. I confirmed the transfer, and in that moment, I felt something shift in my chest. Something that wasn't fear or guilt or resignation. It was acceptance. The same acceptance that the creature itself had been teaching all along. The understanding that some places don't exist to be changed. They exist to be managed. And some people don't exist to survive them. We exist to be learned by something vast and patient and eternally hungry for the shape of human consciousness. I'll keep my job. I'll keep rotating rangers through. And I'll keep the secret, because the secret is the only thing keeping the creature contained. At least, that's what I tell myself when I hear the scratching in the dark. At least, that's what I believe. I accepted the position at Glacier National Park because I needed to disappear. Not literally, though some days I wondered if that would have been kinder. I mean, disappear in the way people do when they step away from their entire life. The job that consumed me, the apartment that held too many ghosts, the city streets where I couldn't walk 5 blocks without seeing her face in the crowd. My ex-wife, Victoria, even her name had become something I couldn't hold in my mind without feeling it splinter. The National Park Service doesn't care much about your personal history. They want certifications, wilderness training, and a baseline competency. I had all 3. 12 years as a ranger in different parks, promoted 3 times, commendations for search and rescue work that I'd rather forget. The hiring office in Helena seemed impressed. They didn't ask why I was transferring at age 43 to one of the most remote ranger stations in Glacier, a position typically given to newer recruits. They accepted that some people are just wilderness people, born for solitude. What I didn't tell them was that the solitude was the entire point. Glacier National Park stretches across over 1 million acres of Montana wilderness. The ranger station where I would be stationed was positioned along Bowman Lake, a 12-mile stretch of crystalline water surrounded by mountains that make you feel insignificant. The nearest permanent structure was the ranger station itself, a log cabin built in 1952 that the Park Service maintained with minimal budget. The nearest civilization was 40 minutes by truck, assuming no washouts in the mountain roads. It was perfect. I arrived in late August, driving a government truck up a gravel road that seemed to absorb the world. My supervisor, a woman named Director Paulson from the regional office, met me to conduct the official handover. She was mid-50s, efficient, and wanted to finish the meeting in under an hour. She showed me the radio system, the supplies protocol, the emergency procedures. She explained that I would conduct 2 patrols per week along established trails, maintain the incident log, and respond to any backcountry emergencies. "It's quiet up here," she said, handing me the keys to the station, "especially this time of year. Summer hikers thin out by September. Come winter, you'll be completely isolated. The Park Service generally advises against staying through December, but if you're certified for winter patrol, we can authorize extended tenure." I told her I was planning to stay through the winter. She looked at me with something approaching concern, but she didn't argue. The Park Service values independence in its rangers. They don't want people who need constant contact or reassurance. After Paulson left, I stood alone in the cabin as the sun dropped behind the mountains. The isolation was immediate and total. No cell service. The radio only connected to other park facilities or the regional office. The nearest neighbor was a park maintenance worker 20 miles south, visited the area perhaps once per month. The cabin itself was sparse but functional. A sleeping cot with a thin mattress, a wood stove for heat, a kitchen area with propane burners, shelves of canned supplies and freeze-dried meals. Maps covered one wall, topographic charts of the surrounding wilderness, trail systems, marked danger zones where avalanches were possible or terrain became too unstable for casual hiking. There were also handwritten notes clipped to the maps, records maintained by previous rangers. I read through them. Trail 7 flooded in June. Ridge approach unsafe after noon thunder. Saw bear sow with cubs near Gunflint Pass. Bridge down at mile marker 8. And then, tucked into the edge of the Bowman Lake map, a single phrase in red ink, underlined twice. Unusual tracks. Undefined species. Reported late season. See incident log. I found the incident log and pulled it open. Most entries were mundane. Lost hiker found at mile marker 6. Equipment theft from main trailhead. Broken ankle requiring evacuation. But the entry I was looking for was dated the previous November, written by the previous ranger, a man named Garrett Voss, November 15. Multiple visitors reported strange track formations near North Shore beach area. Tracks were approximately 15 inches in length. Pattern was unusual. Suggested bipedal locomotion, but stride indicated something between human and quadruped movement. Tracks disappeared at water's edge. No wildlife on record matches the description. Suggested possible hoax, but density of reports and consistency of track patterns argues otherwise. Requesting additional documentation and wildlife consultation. Follow-up pending. The next entry was dated November 20. No response to consultation request. Park veterinarian unable to examine tracks. Weather deteriorated. Area became inaccessible. Voss removed November 25. Removed, which meant transferred, reassigned, or quit. It wasn't clarified. I set the log aside and stepped out onto the cabin's front porch. The sun was nearly gone. Bowman Lake stretched north, its surface like dark glass. The mountains on the opposite shore were becoming silhouettes. The only sound was wind moving through the pines, a sound that wasn't quite natural, too rhythmic, too purposeful. I reminded myself that isolation can do strange things to perception, that a lone ranger's attention becomes hyperactive, finding patterns in randomness, meaning in accident. That previous rangers write about unusual tracks partly because their minds are primed to interpret ambiguity as mystery. But I also knew that I wasn't running from anything here. I was running toward something. The kind of removal from humanity that might allow me to finally think clearly again. To remember what I'd forgotten when Victoria and I were still sharing space in the dark. That some parts of existence don't require another person to validate them. I went inside and started a fire in the wood stove. The cabin warmed gradually. I prepared a simple dinner from the supplies, dehydrated chili that tasted like salt and cardboard, but filled the stomach. I reviewed the patrol schedule and marked out my first week of routes. I cleaned the cabin, organized supplies, established a routine that would carry me through the darkness ahead. By midnight, I was lying on the cot, listening to the wind and something else. Animals moving through the forest. Elk, probably. Or deer, or bears preparing for hibernation. The sounds of wildness that surround any mountain cabin when night falls completely. I told myself I was home now. I should have been more careful about what I was wishing for. The first 2 weeks were exactly what I needed. I established a routine that provided structure without pressure. Morning patrols of the southern trails, checking for hazards and animal activity. Afternoons spent maintaining equipment, updating logs, studying the topographic maps until I could visualize the terrain without looking. Evenings cooking simple meals and reading by kerosene lamp. The radio rarely crackled with anything requiring my attention. The weather remained mild. Indian summer stretched through early September, keeping the high passes clear. The few hikers who remained on the trails were respectful and competent. I saw a family of mule deer, a black bear moving through a berry patch with methodical efficiency, an eagle circling above the ridge. All normal, all expected. But around the third week, I noticed the elk were behaving differently. Normally, the elk herds in Glacier are relatively calm. They've learned not to fear humans, provided humans maintain reasonable distance. I'd seen them before in my years at other parks. They graze, they move. They exist with the kind of indifference that large herbivores develop toward the world. These elk were different. I was on Trail 4, heading north toward Porcupine Ridge, when I encountered a group of 7 animals standing in a meadow. They should have moved when I approached. Elk of that size typically do, moving away at a leisurely pace that's meant to demonstrate they're unimpressed. These animals didn't move. They stood motionless, all facing north, in the direction of the densest forest. Their ears were twisted forward, fixed on something I couldn't see or hear. I stopped my patrol and observed them for several minutes. Their heads didn't swivel. They didn't blink that I could observe. They simply stood and looked north with an intensity that was profoundly unnatural. I radioed the incident to the regional office. The response was perfunctory. Elk behavior changes seasonally. Maybe stress from migration preparation. Nothing to be concerned about. The person responding sounded like they were reading from a manual. But over the next week, I saw the same behavior repeated. Deer frozen in meadows. Jays falling silent in sections of forest where they should have been active. A group of pikas scattered across a rockfall, all facing inward, none of them moving to collect the dried grass they should have been gathering. And then there were the tracks. I found the first prints on a Wednesday morning, near the eastern shore of Bowman Lake in a place called Sunset Point. The beach there is rocky, but there's a thin strip of fine gravel where hikers often walk. The prints were recent. Dew still clung to them, meaning they were made sometime in the night. The size was wrong. Too large for a human, but not large enough for a grizzly. They were deep, suggesting significant weight, but the shape was confusing. The imprint suggested a foot, but the toe arrangement didn't match any animal I could identify. The pattern of prints showed a gait that was neither normal quadruped nor normal biped. It was as though something had walked while crouching, moving with the weight distributed across the soles rather than the toes, the kind of movement you might make if you were trying to be quiet, careful, intentional. The prints stretched for perhaps 30 meters along the beach before stopping abruptly at the water's edge. I photographed them with the station's old digital camera, the images grainy in the morning light. I recorded the location precisely on the map, and I began a more detailed review of Garrett Voss's incident logs. What I found was more revealing than the official records suggested. Voss had maintained detailed notes in a personal ranger journal, separate from the official Park Service documentation. He documented tracks on 5 different occasions between October and November of the previous year. Each sighting was slightly different. Each time, the prints had appeared near water, the lake shore, a stream crossing, a marshy area feeding into the beaver ponds. One entry, dated October 28, contained a photograph that Voss had taped into the journal. The image showed prints in mud, and my stomach tightened when I examined it. These prints were unambiguously large and unambiguously wrong. Too many joints in what appeared to be the foot structure, proportions that suggested something designed differently than any animal I'd encountered. The final entry in Voss's personal journal was dated November 20. Heard sounds this evening, not wildlife, definitely not. Two-tone call, almost like language but not language, source somewhere in the forest north of the cabin. The sounds caused the birds to fall silent. The entire forest went quiet. That doesn't happen naturally. I'm requesting transfer. If the Park Service won't listen, I'll leave anyway. He was gone within days. I set the journal down and tried to think rationally. Voss could have been unstable. Isolation does that sometimes. People alone in wilderness for months develop patterns of thought that slide into paranoia. They find meaning in randomness. They convince themselves that normal phenomena are evidence of something extraordinary. But I'd found the tracks myself. I'd seen the animal behavior, and I was beginning to hear sounds that didn't match the normal forest. The sounds came mostly at night, not the typical nocturnal animal sounds. Owls calling, coyotes howling, the cracking of branches as deer moved. These sounds were something else. They were deliberate, intentional. Sometimes it sounded like something was moving along the cabin's perimeter, large and careful and slow. Sometimes it sounded like something was at the dock, the wooden structure creaking under weight that shouldn't have been distributed that way. And once, on the 25th of September, I heard something that made every thinking part of my brain shut down in fear. It was a call, a vocalization that started low and rose in pitch, holding a frequency that seemed designed to make human teeth ache. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds and was followed by absolute silence. That kind of silence where even the wind seems to stop, where you can hear your own heartbeat in your ears. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the cabin with the wood stove burning, the walls locked, the rifle within arm's reach, and I waited for morning. By the first week of October, I had documented 42 separate incidents of unusual animal behavior, 8 separate track sightings, and 7 instances of what I could only describe as vocalizations. I had photographs, I had measurements, I had detailed maps of where everything occurred, and all of it pointed north, toward the densest part of the forest, toward a place that existed beyond the established trails, where the maps became speculation and the wilderness was genuinely wild. I began to understand why Garrett Voss had left, and I began to understand why I had come. The first missing person report came in on October 12th through the regional office radio. A man named Reed Marchant, 47 years old, had not returned from a solo hiking trip up the Gunflint Trail. His car had been found at the trailhead by another hiker who noticed it had been parked for more than 24 hours past when Marchant was supposed to return. Director Paulson called me directly. This might be nothing. Sometimes people hike longer than planned, camp in the backcountry illegally. But given the terrain and the approaching weather, we're initiating a search. I'm sending 2 additional rangers to assist. ETA 2 hours. How long ago did he start the hike? I asked. He started early morning on the 10th. Told his motel clerk he was planning a day hike. Should have been back by evening. 2 days. In October, in Glacier, that meant exposure and injury were serious possibilities. But that meant something else too. 36 hours was enough time for him to have gotten very far from the established trail if he'd wandered off it. It was enough time for the kind of bad luck, a twisted ankle, a fall, disorientation that kills people in wilderness situations. The 2 rangers arrived by mid-afternoon. Their names were Victor Cross and Bennett Hayes, both younger than me, both with that energy that comes from thinking you're invincible. We reviewed Marchant's hiking permit and the most logical search grid. The Gunflint Trail was a moderate difficulty 14-mile round trip that led to Gunflint Lake at high elevation. Marchant had indicated he planned to walk it in a single day, which was realistic if he maintained pace. He probably sprained something and is sheltering, Victor said, reviewing the maps with overconfident casualness. We find him, give him some ibuprofen and moral support. Lead him out by evening. I didn't mention the tracks. I didn't mention Garrett Voss's journal or the sounds that had been becoming more frequent each night. I told them that the northern approaches had become occasionally unstable and suggested we search the established trail first, heading north. We began the search at dawn on the 13th. The weather had turned. The high pressure that had kept September warm was breaking, clouds moving in from the northwest. Temperature had dropped 15 degrees overnight. The forecast predicted snow in the higher elevations within 2 days. We hiked the Gunflint Trail methodically, calling Marchant's name at regular intervals, looking for signs of someone leaving the trail: broken branches, torn fabric, discarded equipment. The trail was well maintained, easy to follow. There was no evidence that Marchant had left it in the lower sections. We reached the switchback area around Gunflint Lake by late morning. This was where the trail became more technical, where you had to pay attention to foot placement and where the margin for error decreased. Bennett found something here, a lost boot, approximately Marchant's size according to his permit photograph. It was wedged between rocks at the trail's edge, positioned as though someone had pulled their foot out of it while struggling. He lost the boot trying to recover from a fall, Victor suggested, examining the rocks below. He probably went down here, injured himself, and wandered away from the trail while confused. But it didn't match the topography. There was no trail junction near the boot, no alternative path that would make sense for someone to walk if they'd lost a boot. The boot was positioned wrong. It was almost as though someone had deliberately placed it there, knowing it would be found. Below the boot, the rocks descended into a gully that fed into a stream running north. The stream came from the upper reaches of the wilderness, from places that were intentionally difficult to access, where park rangers weren't supposed to go without specific authorization. I radioed back to the cabin. Found evidence of Marchant. Potential serious injury. We're expanding the search grid. Weather deteriorating. We'll need shelter decision by dark. The regional office response came back within minutes. Maintain search. Weather update shows window tomorrow before storm hits. We're bringing a 4th ranger with emergency supplies. Location TBD. We continued searching, spreading out slightly to cover more ground. Bennett headed upslope. Victor worked the stream area. I remained on the trail but extended my search north, back the way we'd come, looking for any sign we'd missed. That's when I found something the others needed to see. The track was pressed into soft earth where the trail briefly crossed a marshy section. It was the size of Voss's documented prints, 15 inches. Humanoid arrangement but with the wrong proportions, wrong number of toe joints, a depth that suggested immense weight concentrated in a small area, and it was fresh. Less than 24 hours old, judging by how the moisture still clung to the pressed-down soil. Victor came back when I called him over. He stared at the track for a long moment. "That's a mistake," he said finally. "Someone's messing with us. Someone in the Park Service playing a prank, making casts, leaving prints." "How many people know about Voss's documentation?" I asked. "Nobody. Official Park Service keeps that classified to prevent hoaxers and thrill-seekers." But Victor didn't look convinced by his own argument. He looked at the track, at the depth of it, at the way the surrounding soil had been disturbed as though by something with genuine mass. "We need to continue the search," he said. "But I don't think we're finding Reed Marchant alive." We found Reed Marchant's body as the sun was dropping behind the western ridge. It was positioned in the forest about 50 meters north of where I'd found the track. He was in an advanced state of exposure. The temperature drop over the past 2 days and nights, combined with the obvious injuries covering his body, had done what autumn does to people who can't shelter themselves. The injuries were the part that no one talked about immediately, but that all 3 of us saw clearly. Marchant had been torn. His clothing was shredded in places that no simple fall could have caused. His left arm was positioned wrong, broken in multiple places and at angles that suggested he'd been subjected to severe violence. His face was turned down into the earth, partially buried, as though something had been trying to hide him. Bennett got sick. He moved away from the body and vomited quietly into the forest, his hands on his knees, his entire young certainty broken apart. Victor called it in while I examined the area without approaching the body directly. The forest here was marked with disturbance. Branches broken at heights that no human could reach, soil churned as though by something moving in circles, pacing. And more tracks. These were clearer in the softened earth around the body. The same pattern as before. Multiple animals, maybe 3. Moving in a coordinated pattern. Hunting pattern. Search and rescue is incoming, Victor reported, looking pale. They're bringing equipment for evening extraction. We need to secure the scene and maintain position. So we waited in the forest as darkness fell, 3 rangers surrounding a body that clearly hadn't died from natural causes or simple accident. We maintained radio contact with the incoming teams. We tried not to look at the injuries, and I listened to the sounds of the forest around us, sounds that had become increasingly familiar, increasingly close. The vocalization came around 8 p.m., from somewhere north of our position, up in the high forest where the trails didn't go. That same frequency that made teeth ache, but this time it was answered from another direction. Then another. 3 different sources, moving at different speeds, converging on something we couldn't see. Those are animals, Victor said, but his voice lacked conviction. Mountain lions or bears, responding to, but they weren't animals, not in any conventional sense. And we both knew it. The search and rescue team arrived with helicopter support just before 9 p.m. The extraction was complicated by darkness and the forest density. They brought body bags and proper equipment. They secured Reed Marchant's remains and flew the body back to the main park facility. In the official reports, his death was attributed to environmental exposure, injury, and disorientation. There was no mention of the torn tissue, the severe trauma, the coordinated hunting pattern, but there was mention of the tracks. The SAR team's wildlife expert, a man named Dr. Morris Hendricks, who worked for the Park Service, examined the prints we documented. He was thorough and professional. He took measurements, photographed everything, collected soil samples. When he was finished, he took me aside. "I don't know what made these," he said flatly. "And I'm saying that professionally. There are 12 major predator species in this park. I can rule out all of them. The anatomy suggested here doesn't match any North American wildlife. The movement pattern suggests intelligence. The concentration in this specific geographic area suggests territory, hunting ground, intentional behavior. So what do we do?" I asked. "We document everything. We increase ranger presence. We close certain trails to public access if necessary. And we hope that whatever this is, it was just passing through." But we both knew better. Within a week, there was a second incident. A woman named Sonia Adams, hiking alone despite Park Service recommendations against solo hiking, went missing on the Bowman Lake Circuit Trail. This trail ran closer to the cabin, closer to my area of patrol. Her car was found at the south parking area. Her body was never found. The search lasted 4 days. We covered every inch of the marked trail and explored the areas immediately adjacent to it. We found no body, no clothing, no trace of what happened. It was as though she had simply been taken. The official record indicated that she was likely still alive, possibly injured and disoriented, possibly a voluntary disappearance. The Park Service asked for volunteer hikers to come search. Most people, when they read the details, a woman alone in the wilderness, no body, no definitive death, became convinced that she might be found alive. They came in groups of 10 and 15. They searched the forest. That's when things accelerated. 3 separate groups reported being followed while hiking. They described a feeling of being tracked, of something moving in parallel to them through the forest, of sounds that made their dogs refuse to move forward. One group of 8 hikers reported seeing something, large, moving on two legs, its shape wrong in ways they struggled to describe, watching them from a ridgeline. Another group reported that all of their food supplies had been systematically torn apart and scattered during the night while they sheltered in a cave. The Park Service, alarmed and unable to explain the phenomena, quietly shut down the trails. Not officially closed, there was no formal announcement, but access permits were denied. Rangers were increased, warnings were issued about bears and unstable terrain. Within 2 weeks, most of the search volunteers stopped coming. I remained at the cabin, and I became increasingly afraid. The sounds had become constant. Every night, something moved around the perimeter. I kept the wood stove burning continually, not for heat but for light, filling the cabin with orange glow that seemed to keep the worst of the darkness at bay. I reinforced the door. I kept windows covered. I maintained a loaded rifle within arm's reach at all times, and I started seeing things. On the night of October 28th, exactly 1 year after Voss had heard the strange sounds, I woke to find something at the cabin's front window. In the darkness, backlit by moonlight, I saw a shape, roughly human in silhouette, but the proportions were too long in the limbs, too wide in the shoulders. It stood at the window for perhaps 30 seconds, completely motionless, and then it was gone. I didn't sleep for 3 days. The journal entries I began writing around this time read like the ravings of someone coming apart. They probably were. Isolation, fear, the cognitive dissonance between the official denial of what was happening and the physical reality I was experiencing. It was enough to destabilize anyone. I documented every unusual sound, every strange occurrence, every moment when my certainty about reality seemed to slip. But I also documented something else. I began to piece together the pattern. Whatever was in the forest, it was intelligent, it was organized. It seemed to understand how park rangers operated, how search teams would move, where humans congregated. The disappearances always happened near established trails. The incidents reported by hikers always occurred in the areas that received heavy foot traffic. The creature or creatures were learning us. They were adapting to human presence rather than avoiding it, and they were growing bolder. The third incident, the one that should have forced official acknowledgement, occurred on November 3rd. A ranger named Marcus Webb, conducting a routine trail check in an area I had suggested was dangerous, failed to return from his patrol. Marcus was experienced, cautious, and well-equipped. He was also the closest thing to a friend I'd made since arriving at Glacier. The search for Marcus took on an urgent tone that the others hadn't. This wasn't a missing hiker. This was a ranger, someone the Park Service understood and wanted to protect. Director Paulson arrived in person. Additional resources were mobilized. Helicopters searched the ridgelines. On the third day, we found Marcus in a ravine that had been marked off as impassable on the maps. He had fallen, according to the official story. His body had impact trauma, injuries consistent with a significant fall, but he was also positioned in a way that suggested he'd been posed, placed carefully in the ravine, arranged almost respectfully, as though something had wanted us to find him. I knelt beside his body, looking at his face, the face of someone who had believed the danger warnings I'd given him but had gone out anyway because that's what rangers do. We accept the risks. We go. The vocalization came from above, from the ravine's rim, during the twilight moment between day and night when human vision becomes unreliable. It was different from before. Not a hunting call, a communicative sound, as though something was announcing its presence, establishing dominance, making clear that the forest belonged to it and not to us. When I looked up, I saw them. 3 shapes on the ridgeline, roughly humanoid, massive, completely still. watching us examine the body of the thing we'd sent to be killed. Dr. Hendricks was there, having flown in for the recovery effort. He saw them too. His face went completely white. "Get everyone back to the vehicles," Director Paulson ordered immediately. "Now, move." We scrambled down from the ravine, Marcus's body abandoned temporarily in the rush to remove ourselves from the area. The shapes on the ridge didn't follow. They simply watched as we retreated, their presence a statement of territorial control. In the official incident report, those shapes were recorded as possible bears. Large bears, unusual configuration, difficult to identify in poor lighting. The report suggested that we had been in a dangerous situation with aggressive wildlife and that immediate action was necessary, but nobody believed that. The look in Dr. Hendricks' eyes, the way Director Paulson was already making calls about trail closures and ranger withdrawal, the absolute silence of the younger rangers who had seen those shapes in the twilight, none of us believed the official story. By November 10th, all non-essential personnel had been withdrawn from Glacier's backcountry. The ranger station was scheduled to close. Director Paulson informed me that I would be relocated to the front desk facilities in the main visitors center. The cabin would be boarded up until spring, but I refused to leave. "I'm requesting to remain at the station," I told Paulson during the video conference. "Winter operations, wildlife monitoring, any additional security measures deemed necessary." "That's not advisable," she said, her face showing the strain of the past weeks. "We're closing that station. I can remain independently if necessary. I'm not requesting Park Service support. I'll maintain my own supplies, conduct my own operations." She stared at me through the screen. I could see her calculating something. The liability of allowing a ranger to remain alone at a closed station. The alternative of forcing me to leave and having me ignore the order, which created different liability. The exhaustion of someone who had been dealing with something her training had never prepared her for. "1 week," she said finally. "1 week and then you leave. No exceptions. That's an order. 1 week." It was now November 11th. 7 days until I would be forced to leave this place, to return to civilization, to attempt to reintegrate into a world where I had never belonged and certainly didn't belong now. 7 days before the forest would be left alone with whatever lived in its depths. I accepted the terms and signed off. That night, I heard them calling to each other in the forest. Multiple voices now. More than 3, perhaps many more. They were gathering, preparing for something, or waiting for something. The final 7 days blurred into a sequence of moments that seemed to operate outside normal time. I kept the journal, but the entries became fragmentary, almost poetic in their disconnection from rational documentation. I recorded sounds. I recorded observations. I recorded the way the forest seemed to be transforming around me, as though winter was arriving not through normal seasonal progression but through some other mechanism entirely. The temperature dropped dramatically on November 13th, not gradually but in a sudden shift, as though someone had reset the world's thermostat. By evening, frost covered everything. The cabin walls, the trees, the surface of Bowman Lake. The water had begun to freeze, moving outward from the shore in increasingly thick plates of ice. I understood what was coming. Not intellectually, I'd moved past intellect, but in the way animals understand things, in the way a deer knows when a predator is near, in the way humans once understood the world before we invented reason and science and the pretense that understanding means mastery. The vocalizations intensified. They were no longer calls of simple territorial behavior, but something far more complex. There was urgency in them, anticipation. They moved closer to the cabin each night. I could feel their weight through the walls, their massive bodies pacing the perimeter, testing the wood and stone as though measuring its integrity, calculating whether they could breach it if they chose. On November 15th, I began to hear voices, not voices exactly, but the impression of communication, language existing just below the threshold of human comprehension. It was as though they were teaching me something, or trying to, and I was too limited to fully grasp it. The closest equivalent I could reach was the memory of studying a foreign language when young, hearing the sounds, understanding the patterns, knowing there was meaning beneath them, but not quite able to access it. I found myself moving between lucid periods and moments of dissociation. In one period, I reviewed the incident logs, Voss's journal, the photographs and measurements. In another, I stood at the window for hours watching the forest, aware that something was watching me, that we were locked in mutual observation. In another, I wrote a letter to Victoria. I don't remember consciously choosing to write it. I simply found myself with paper and pen, my hand moving without clear intention. I wrote about why I had left, about how the marriage had become a pressure that was suffocating something essential in me, about how I had needed wilderness not because I was running away, but because I was running toward the part of myself that had always belonged there, that had never truly adapted to civilization, to confined spaces, to the constant negotiation of human proximity. And I wrote about what I had found in the forest. I tried to explain that there were things in existence that didn't fit into the categories humans had created, things that were neither simply animal nor simply intelligent, neither hostile nor friendly, but operating according to their own logic and purpose. And that understanding, that being in proximity to that, had made me feel less alone than I had ever felt in the presence of another human. I sealed the letter and set it aside. I would never send it, but the act of writing it clarified something. On November 17th, my last day before forced departure, the boundary between myself and the forest seemed to dissolve. I woke knowing that something had changed. The cabin was silent. The vocalizations had ceased. The sounds of movement around the perimeter had stopped. The birds, which had been mostly absent since September, were absent now in a way that felt absolute and final. I opened the door. The cold hit me like immersion in water. The thermometer outside read -18 degrees. The ice on Bowman Lake had thickened. The forest was white with frost and early snow. Everything was crystalline. Everything was still, and standing on the beach, approximately 100 yards from the cabin, were 4 of them. I cannot describe them accurately. The human mind is not equipped to describe things that don't fit human categories. They were vaguely bipedal, but configured with proportions that suggested a completely different skeletal structure than humans. They were massive, easily 8 feet tall, perhaps more. Their skin appeared dark, almost black, but it caught the light in ways that suggested it wasn't actually skin in any conventional sense. Their eyes, what I could see of them, were small and positioned differently than human eyes, suggesting vision that operated across different spectrums. They stood completely motionless, watching me. 4 beings and 1 human, separated by 100 yards and the entire evolutionary distance between 2 incompatible species. In that moment, all of my academic training, all of the rational filters I'd maintained to function in civilization, all of the cognitive frameworks I'd used to understand the world, simply fell away. They felt like unnecessary weights that I'd been carrying for 43 years. I stepped off the cabin porch and walked toward them. I don't know how long I walked. The distance might have been 50 yards or 500. The snow beneath my feet might have been an inch deep or a foot. The temperature might have been growing colder, or I might have simply stopped registering cold. When I stopped, I was perhaps 15 feet from the nearest one, close enough to see the texture of its surface, the way its chest rose and fell with breathing. the careful intelligence in the configuration of its features. It made a sound. Not the hunting vocalization, not the communication sounds. Something else. Something that passed directly from the creature's chest into my chest. A frequency that didn't need to travel through air or depend on ears to be perceived. And I understood. I understood that Garrett Voss had not been wrong. I understood that the tracks and the incidents and the missing people were exactly what they appeared to be. I understood that the forest north of the established civilization boundary was indeed home to something that didn't match any human category. And I understood that I belonged there far more than I belonged in the world I'd left behind. I also understood that Director Paulson was correct, in a way. I would leave. I would return to the visitor center, to the normal world, to the pretense of human civilization. The Park Service would close the station. Rangers would avoid the area. Gradually, the story of Glacier's strangeness would become legend, dismissed as misidentification and group hysteria. But something had changed in the forest, or I had changed, or the boundary between us had become permeable in a way it wasn't before. The creature closest to me made another sound. The other three moved back toward the forest, disappearing into the snow and darkness with no indication that they had ever been visible. The one remaining watched me for a moment longer, and then it turned away as well. I don't know how long I stood there afterward. Time seemed to operate differently. When I finally looked back toward the cabin, the light had changed. It was afternoon, or perhaps it was the next morning. The snow had deepened. The footprints I'd left behind me were already being covered, the landscape beginning the process of erasing evidence of my presence. I returned to the cabin, packed the equipment I needed, and prepared for the drive out. I didn't file incident reports. I didn't document what I'd seen. I simply completed the logistical requirements of leaving. Director Paulson met me at the main facility. She was relieved that I was leaving, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she understood that something had changed in me, that I had crossed some threshold that civilization couldn't accommodate. She asked if I had any final observations about the Glacier situation. I told her what she wanted to hear: unusual animal behavior, possible undocumented species, recommendation for further study, controlled access, possible wildlife management consultation. All technically true, all completely missing the point. I never returned to my previous life. I took a position at a remote fire lookout tower in Oregon, and then another at a remote weather station in Alaska. I moved through positions that required isolation, that positioned me on boundaries between the human world and whatever exists beyond it. And every winter, particularly at the solstice when light is minimal and cold is absolute, I hear them. Not through any physical mechanism that I can identify, but I hear them calling. And I understand that some part of me never left Glacier. Some part of me remains standing on that frozen beach, watching shapes move through the darkness, finally understanding that belonging doesn't require reciprocal recognition. It requires only that you stop resisting, and instead listen to what the wild is trying to tell you, even if the telling is meant to destroy.